Welcome to Consider Life. Today we're going to be finishing off our series of what I would have said to a skeptic or atheist. This last video we're going to look at a section of Sean Carroll's response. Sean Carroll's a physicist. We're going to look at Sean Carroll's response to the fine-tuning argument and his rebuttal of that, or his counter-argument, I should say.
Argument, the teleological argument from fine-tuning, I'm very happy to admit right off the bat, this is the best argument that the theists have when it comes to cosmology. That's because it plays by the rules.
Now, I'll just say this. There's a distinction between the teleological argument and the argument from design. Oftentimes, the teleological arguments and the teleological argument and the arguments from design are conflated by philosophers of religion, and so it's not strange that Carroll would do that here. But strictly speaking, a teleological argument is it assumes a philosophy of nature wherein things have a telos, and it gives an explanation for that telos. Design arguments, by and large, do not necessarily have a philosophy of nature that is, say, Aristotelian in its structure. And so we can make a distinction between teleological arguments and design arguments. We don't necessarily have to, but there is a distinction to be made. And okay. We'll just move on.
You have phenomena, you have parameters of particle physics and cosmology, and then you have two different models, theism and naturalism, and you want to compare which model is the best fit for the data. I applaud that general approach. Given that, it is still a terrible argument. It is not at all convincing. I will give you 5 quick reasons why.
Now, to be fair, I mean, Carroll just started out by saying that the fine-tuning argument is one of the best arguments for theism, and now he's saying that it's a terrible argument. Now, he appreciates the theoretical approach where you have a theory that tries to fit the data. So how can he both say that it's the best argument for Christian theism and that it's a terrible argument that's in no way supportable or something like that? That just seems odd to me.
Why theism does not offer a solution to the purported fine-tuning problem. First, I am by no means convinced that there is a fine-tuning problem, and again, Dr. Craig offered no evidence for it. It is certainly true that if you change the parameters of nature, our local conditions that we observe around us would change by a lot. I grant that quickly. I do not grant that therefore life could not exist.
Now, I've looked at some of Bill Craig's stuff, and when Carroll admits that if you change the parameters of nature, our local environment would change, that's not the point. When Craig is making an argument for fine-tuning, he's saying at the cosmological level, at these very early parameters of the known universe, that if you change these by a very, very small margin, then complex, intelligent biological life couldn't exist, right? So that's Craig's point. Not that our local environment would change, but that the nature of the universe itself would be different, such that it would not, say, only hydrogen would exist or something like that. Anyway.
I will start granting that once someone tells me the conditions under which life can exist. What is the definition of life, for example? If it's just information processing, thinking, or something like that, there's a huge panoply of possibilities. They sound very science fiction-y, but then again, you're the one who's changing the parameters of the universe. The results are going to sound like they come from a science fiction novel.
Now, again, and I've been reading Alistair McGrath's God and Science, or Science and Religion, in preparation for a class that I'm teaching this fall. Anyway, one of the things to note is that the approach to these kinds of arguments very much are what are called retrospective. That is, given the complexity, the features of the known universe, right? And then arguing back for what kind of cause is the best explanation for the known parameters or the parameters of the known universe.
Sadly, we just don't know whether life could exist if the conditions of our universe were very different, because we only see the universe that we see.
And again, we don't mean life in general. We mean the kind of life that we do observe, carbon-based intelligent life, right? So it's not life in the theoretic. It's the parameters that would be required for life as we know it. Okay, let's just put that caveat or that modifier in there. life as we know it, carbon-based, intelligent, complex life. That's the kind of life that we mean. And we do know that that if some of the fundamental constants were changed, that things like planets couldn't exist, or stars wouldn't have formed, or things like that. Now, I'll link in the description to this video, a video that Bill Craig did a number of years ago. A friend of mine, Jim, was the animator on this, and he and Bill collaborated on the script. And I actually did the voiceover for the script. And so if you recognize the pleasant timbre of my voice in this video that I'm going to link in the description. But if you look at that video, and it's relatively short, I think it's about 6 minutes or so, that video will explain Bill Craig's position. And then if you watch these two, the two in concert, you'll understand what Bill Craig's assertions are, and then what Carroll's response to them. I probably should have said that earlier, but this is a response video, and I just thought of it.
Secondly, God doesn't need to fine-tune anything. We talk about the parameters of physics and cosmology, the mass of the electron, the strength of gravity, and we say if they weren't the numbers that they were, then life itself could not exist. That really underestimates God by a lot, which is surprising from theists, I think. In theism, life is not purely physical. It's not purely a collection of atoms doing things like it is in naturalism. I would think that no matter what the atoms were doing, God could still create life. God doesn't care what the mass of the electron is. He can do what he wants. The only framework in which you can honestly say...
Again, this is why I made the retrospective point. And it's not Sean Carroll's fault that as a professional scientist, he thinks as a professional scientist. I was just rereading elements of Anthony Flew There Is a God, where Anthony Flew, because of the evidences from modern science, origin of life research, and fine-tuning of the universe, he was converted from 5 decades of being an atheist to what we call philosophical theism. To my knowledge, he didn't become a Christian, a born-again Christian, before he died, but he was converted from philosophical atheism to philosophical theism. He believed that there was a mind, an intelligent source from which the universe and life arose. And he believed that based on his interpretation of modern science, a philosophical interpretation. And so going back to, this is not a prospective argument. We're not saying that God exists and then God did this and that. What we're saying is retrospectively, given what we find in the known universe, intelligence, a transcendent intelligence, is the best explanation for that. It's not that God couldn't have created differently. That's not even a question. The question is, given the kind of universe that we do find, what is the best explanation of that? Is it some mindless material natural cause, or is it a transcendent immaterial mindful cause? And given the fact that the parameters of the early universe were such that if they were not fine-tuned to the places that they were in all independently, that complex life wouldn't have arisen. That's kind of the whole thrust anyway.
That the physical parameters of the universe must take on certain values in order for life to exist is naturalism. The third point is that the fine-tunings that you think are there might go away once you understand the universe better. They might only be apparent. There's a famous example that theists like to give, or even cosmologists who haven't thought about it enough, that the expansion rate of the early universe is tuned to within 1 part in 10 to the 60th. That's the naive estimate back of the envelope, pencil, and paper you would do. But in this case, you can do better. You can go into the equations of general relativity, and there is a correct, rigorous derivation of the probability. And when you ask the same question using the correct equations, you find that the probability is 1. All but a set of measure 0 of early universe cosmologies have the right expansion rate to live for a long time and allow life to exist.
Okay. Now, again, I'm not a scientist, and I haven't gone into the equations, as it were. But the probability being 1, a probability of 1 is necessity. It's impossible for it to have been otherwise. And so I'm skeptical about Carroll's claim that the science in fact does show that that these independent parameters of the known universe, or something like the expansion rate, I think he's specifically talking just about the expansion rate, it's impossible that it would have been different, and it's physically necessary that it is the way it actually is, because that's what the rhetorical value is here. If the probability is 1, that means it's impossible to have been otherwise, and I'm skeptical that that's actually what the science says.
I can't say that all parameters fit into that paradigm, but until we know the answer, we can't claim that they are definitely finely tuned. Number 4, there's an obvious and easy.
Okay, maybe we got the expansion parameter wrong. Maybe some of the other parameters might turn out to be different, but that's not the question. The question is, given what we know scientifically about the known universe, is it more probable that it was the product of a mindless natural cause or the product of a transcendent mindful cause? That's the question. So this is a bit of a red herring, I think.
Naturalistic explanation in the form of the cosmological multiverse. People like to worry about the multiverse. It sounds extravagant. I claim the multiverse is amazingly simple. It is not a theory. It is the prediction of physical theories that are themselves quite elegant, small, and self-contained that create universe after universes. There's no reason, no right that we have to expect that the whole entire universe looks like the conditions we have right now. But more importantly, if you take the multiverse as your starting point, you can make predictions. We live in an ensemble, and we should be able to predict the likelihoods that the conditions around us take different forms. So in cosmology papers dealing with the multiverse, you see graphs like this that try to predict the density of dark matter given other conditions in the multiverse. You do not see graphs like this in the theological papers trying to give God credit for explaining the fine-tuning, because theism is not well-defined. Fifth, and most importantly, theism fails.
Okay, and now this simply is. I mean, regardless of the, I'm not going to speak to the benefits or detriments of the multiverse hypothesis, but the rhetorical point here that you don't see graphs like this in theological papers because God is not well defined. This is actually a category mistake, because Carroll seems to be assuming that any good, clear definition is a rigorously mathematical one, but that simply takes the methods and practices of the natural sciences and makes them the standard by which other disciplines are measured, which is in vogue at this point. But I think it's wrong-headed, right?
Fails as an explanation. Even if you think the universe is finely tuned and you don't think that naturalism can solve it, theism certainly does not solve it. If you thought it did, if you played the game honestly, what you would say is, here is the universe that I expect to exist under theism. I will compare it to the data and see if it fits. What kind of universe would we expect? And I would claim that over and over again, the universe we expect matches the predictions of naturalism, not theism. So the amount of tuning, if you thought that the physical parameters of our universe were tuned in order to allow life to exist, you would expect enough tuning but not too much. Under naturalism, a physical mechanism could far over-tune by an incredibly large amount that has nothing to do with the existence of life, and that is exactly what we observe. For example, the entropy of the early universe is much, 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 much lower than it needs to be to allow for life. You would expect under theism that the particles and parameters of particle physics would be enough to allow life to exist and have some structure that was designed for some reason, whereas under naturalism you'd expect them to be kind of random and a mess. Guess what? They are kind of random and a mess. You would expect under theism life to play a special role in the universe. Under naturalism you'd expect life to be very insignificant. I hope I don't need to tell you.
Okay, this is, I think this whole line of reasoning is wrong-headed. Early on, Carroll said that it doesn't matter that an omnipotent God can do whatever he wants with the mass of an electron and still make life work. And it seems to be here saying that, well, because the mass of an electron or these physical parameters are the way they are, you wouldn't expect that on theism. Well, what would you expect on theism? That there would be a well-ordered universe. And that's what we do, in fact, observe, is a well-ordered universe. And then he plays his card too much here when he says, you would expect life to be insignificant. Insignificance is a value statement. That is not something that scientists measure. Carroll here very much is speaking in a philosophical vein, but the reason he doesn't recognize that he's speaking in a philosophical vein is because he's not a philosopher. But saying that, now you could say this mathematically, that life is rare in the universe, but to say that life is insignificant in the universe is, again, it's a category mistake. And we would say that because life is so rare, that tends to increase the value of it. But here, there's nothing in his background as a theoretical physicist for him to say that life is insignificant in the universe, and therefore naturalism is a better explanation. That doesn't follow at all.
Life is very insignificant as far as the universe is concerned. Here is a photograph from the Hubble Space Telescope of a few hundred out of the hundreds of billions of galaxies in our observable universe. The theistic explanation for cosmological fine-tuning asks you to look at this picture and say, I know why it's like that. It's because I was going to be here, or we were going to be here. But there is nothing in our experience of the universe that justifies the kind of flattering story we like to tell about ourselves. In fact, I would argue that the failure of theism to explain the fine-tuning of the universe is paradigmatic. It helps understand the other ways in which theism fails to be a better theory than naturalism. What you should be doing over and over again is comparing the predictions or expectations under theism to under naturalism. You find that over and over again, naturalism wins. And I'm going
again, theism is not predictive here. Theism's role, and again, this is Carroll's approach as a scientist, where you have a hypothesis and then you use it as predictive, and then you run experimental tests. That is not the question at issue here. Again, somebody like Alistair McGrath admits, no, when we're doing natural theology, when we're using science as a means for doing natural theology, a philosophical analysis of the state of the known universe, it is very much retrospective. We're seeing the evidence that we do have. So Carroll having this approach of saying that, assume theism and then run that hypothesis as against some experiments or against the evidence. Now assume naturalism and then run that. That's not the way natural theology usually approaches things like cosmological arguments. They start with the known universe, and then we ask what is the best explanation of that, and then we assess theoretical virtues, right? So, okay, let's do this just a little bit. Theoretical virtues: simplicity, explanatory scope, explanatory power, fecundity, simplicity, things like that. I think I already said simplicity, aesthetic values, something like that. Not only does the assumption of theism or the hypothesis of theism explain something that we couldn't have predicted 100 years ago, namely the fine-tuning parameter of the universe, but it also explains things like why the mathematics of our physics. Mathematics, which is a product of human thinking. We don't stumble across mathematics in nature. Mathematics is an accord between the technical mathematics that arise in the mind of the mathematician or the physicist, and its application to natural phenomena, to whatever places past the decimal point in precision. Why is there an accord between the mathematics used in theoretical physics and the physical systems themselves? Right? That's not on explanation that the human mind has this capacity. In what Darwinian scenario would this level of mathematical precision in our understanding the deep forces of nature help us secure a mate or provide for our progeny in a crassly Darwinian fashion? Naturalism doesn't explain that. So again, that's the kind of theoretical virtues that theism does have. It is able to make a cumulative case based on everything about the known universe. Anyway, I'm trying to restrict myself to just the reaction to Carroll here, but it is a reaction because I haven't watched this fully all the way through. It's just enough to know that it's the video that I wanted to pick. But this sort of prospective approach to assessing naturalism and theism Yeah, anyway, okay.
I'm going to zoom through these. It's not the individual arguments that are important, it's the accumulated effect. If theism were really true, there's no reason for God to be hard to find. He should be perfectly obvious, whereas in naturalism, you might expect people believe in God.
Okay, this is the hiddenness of God argument, a philosophy of religion issue. This has nothing to do with his background as a scientist. I read a book by Hugh Ross where he mentions, unfortunately he doesn't cite this, but he mentions an argument from the 1600s where an atheist said, well, if God existed, there's no way that God exists, because if God existed, why would the continents be so far apart? And it would take months of travel to get between one and the other, right? This is the kind of I would say superficial philosophical reasoning that can arise apparently even from a Caltech physicist. If God existed, he would be easier to find.
But the evidence to be thin on the ground. Under theism, you'd expect that religious beliefs should be universal. There's no reason for God to give special messages to this or that primitive tribe thousands of years ago. Why not give it to anyone? Whereas under naturalism, you'd expect different religious beliefs inconsistent with each other to grow up under different local conditions. Under theism, you'd expect religious doctrines to last a long time in a stable way. Under naturalism, you'd expect them to adapt to social conditions. Under theism, you'd expect the moral teachings of religion to be transcendent, progressive, sexism is wrong, slavery is wrong. Under naturalism, you'd expect that they reflect, once again, local mores, sometimes good rules, sometimes not so good. You'd expect the...
If there weren't some transcendent standard for saying that one culture is better than another, then Sean Carroll couldn't even say that one culture is better than another, or that our present moral understanding is better than our previous moral understanding. There has to be some objectivity to these things in order to put them at odds with one another or say that one is superior than another.
Sacred texts under theism to give us interesting information. Tell us about the germ theory of disease. Tell us to wash our hands before we have dinner. Under naturalism, you'd expect that sacred texts to be a mishmash, some really good parts, some poetic parts, and some boring parts and mythological parts. Under theism, you'd expect biological forms to be designed. Under naturalism, they would derive from the twists and turns of evolutionary.
Okay, we responded a little bit to the paleontological thing in Christopher Hitchens. I got some negative commentary about not going into that. And again, in order to understand the design in biology and the intelligent design position versus, accounts of creationism, that it takes a longer discussion than just the reaction video. And I plan on doing that in a series of videos where I start from a proper epistemological approach to the natural sciences, from that building up an eclectic philosophy of science position, and then from that eclecticism addressing the issue of biological design and neo-Darwinism. So we'll do that in a future video series.
History. Under theism, minds should be independent of bodies. Under naturalism, your personality should change if you're injured, tired, or you haven't had your cup of coffee yet.
False. Under theism, minds should be independent of bodies. Okay, there he's committing theism to something like substance dualism, where the mind is an independent substance from the body, and there's some sort of interaction. Okay, in the Philosophy 101 video, we talked about hylomorphism. Hylomorphism means that there's an immaterial and a material aspect to humanity, and they're very much intertwined. I'm not going to recap some of that stuff here, but Thomas Aquinas' account of anthropology, philosophical anthropology, can very much take account of why it is that you have memory loss if you have a traumatic brain injury, or why you act differently when you're drunk or you're tired, right? Hylomorphism does this perfectly well without being committed to a substance dualist version of theism or committed to materialistic naturalism.
Under theism, you'd expect that maybe you can explain the problem of evil. God wants us to have free will, but there shouldn't be random suffering in the universe. Life should be essentially just. And at the end of the day, in theism, you basically expect the universe to be perfect. Under naturalism, it should be kind of a mess. This is very strong empirical evidence.
Okay, I'll finish the video and I'll finish the reaction, but I would say this. Most of the points that Dr. Carroll is raising are points of discussion within the philosophy of religion. And philosophers of religion do have debates over these issues, and there are very good resources for addressing some of the concerns that he raises here, none of which are novel or overweening objections to Christian theism writ large.
Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, but I can explain all of that. I know you can explain all. So can I. It's not hard to come up with ex post facto justifications for why God would have done it that way. Why is it not hard? Because theism is not well defined. That's what computer scientists call a bug, not a feature. Immanuel Kant famously said, there will never be an Isaac Newton for a blade of grass. In other words, sure, you can find some physical explanation for the motion of the planets, but never for something as exquisitely organized and complex as a biological organism. Except, of course, that Charles Darwin then went and did exactly that. We can paraphrase Dr. Craig's message as saying, there will never be an Isaac Newton for the cosmos. But everything we know about the history of science and the current state of physics says we should be much more optimistic than that. Thank you.
Okay, so that's the end of the video. That's the end of this portion of Carroll's response to William Lane Craig. And I haven't watched the entirety of the debate. I wanted to find something that was piecemeal that we could react to. So those are some of my reactions. As kind of a final thought, the idea that theism is not well defined. Again, if you go back to wanting something like a mathematical definition of God, something that has the rigor of mathematics, you're not going to find that. But for example, in classical theism, that God is pure act, that he's simple, that he's eternal, and then defining all of these things in a very careful way, that's the entire business of the philosophy of religion. Now, are there debates among philosophers of religion? Yes, sure. In the same way that there's debates between scientists about prevailing theories or interpretation of evidences, things like that. Now, look, as a working philosopher of religion, it's easy to take on an air of condescension toward a scientist who doesn't understand the way in which these debates emerge within my own discipline. And I will freely admit that I don't understand the intricacies of the cosmological science. But what I am saying is that once you step away from the science, it's almost inevitable that you make philosophical extrapolations from the science itself. And so once Carroll starts branching out and talking about the ultimate implications for one's view of the universe that this science has, Christian apologetics, or the only task of Christian apologetics, is to show that some version of Christian theism is rationally acceptable based on the best evidences of the day. And this is something that Bill Craig does, I think, quite well. And that he shows that there is at least a rational compatibility between the most rigorous 21st century theoretical physics and Christian theism, right? I think that says a lot, that our religion, our belief system, our spiritual, our view of spirituality and God, and none of that requires any radical adjustment based on the best science of our day. Now, is it debatable? Sure. Yeah. But I think Christianity at least passes the hurdle of it is completely rational to be a full-blown Christian theist, Bible-believing, hopefully not thumping, Bible-believing Christian in 21st century America, and understand what the best science of the day says about these things. So I'm not sure what the next videos will entail. I just wanted to get something posted this week. And we'll see. We'll see what happens next.